In a town where the law was just another tool for the corrupt. One man came back home, and became their worst nightmare. But taking down a crooked sheriff was just the beginning, because the real power hides in the shadows. And when the system fights back, how far will he go for justice? The road leading into Rosewood stretched long and empty. The asphalt cracked from years of neglect. The late afternoon sun bathed the town in a golden hue, but it did little to mask the quiet tension hanging in the air. Storefronts lined Main Street, their signs faded and peeling. A few people stood outside the hardware store, talking in hushed tones. They glanced at Ethan's truck as he passed, their expressions unreadable. Ethan Cole hadn't set foot in Rosewood in over a decade. The town had changed, but not for the better. It had the same houses, the same streets, but there was a weight in the air. Something unspoken, something that didn't sit right. He turned onto a familiar street, the one leading to his childhood home. The house stood at the end of the block, its white paint faded, the wooden porch showing signs of wear. It had been empty since his parents passed, left untouched, waiting for someone to breathe life back into it. He stepped out of his truck, stretching his stiff shoulders. The air smelled of pine and distant rain, a storm forming somewhere on the horizon. As he grabbed his bag from the backseat, a voice called out, "Didn't think I'd see you around here again." Ethan turned. Ryan Mitchell leaned against a lamppost, arms crossed. He looked older than Ethan remembered, the years having added lines to his face. "I didn't think I'd be back either," Ethan admitted, "but here I am." Ryan studied him for a moment before nodding toward the cafe across the street. "Come on, let's talk." The place hadn't changed much since Ethan was a kid. The booths were the same. The coffee still smelled burnt, and the waitress behind the counter looked like she'd been working there forever. They took a booth near the window. Ryan stirred his coffee absent-mindedly. "Things are different now, Ethan. This town, it's not what it used to be." Ethan didn't respond. He had seen it in the way people carried themselves, heads down, shoulders hunched, as if waiting for something bad to happen. Ryan sighed. "Henderson and Torres run things now. They don't just enforce the law. They decide what the law is." Ethan had heard the names before. Henderson was the sheriff, Torres his right-hand man. They weren't just cops, they were enforcers, ruling Rosewood through intimidation. "People don't talk much," Ryan continued, "not unless they want trouble." Ethan took a sip of his coffee, the bitterness sharp on his tongue. "And you?" Ryan hesitated. "I do what I can. But there's only so much one person can do." There was more to it. Ethan could hear the frustration in Ryan's voice, the weight of knowing the system was broken but being powerless to change it. A group of men entered the cafe. They were dressed in plain clothes, but something about their stance, the way they carried themselves, told Ethan they were law enforcement. One of them, stocky build, square jaw, locked eyes with Ethan for a brief moment before turning away. "That's Torres," Ryan muttered. "Don't give him a reason to notice you." Ethan finished his coffee and placed a few bills on the table. Too late for that. As he stepped outside, the air felt heavier. People moved around him, but he could sense the undercurrent of fear, the way they avoided looking at him for too long. He walked toward his truck, feeling eyes on him. The drive home was quiet, the kind of quiet that made his instincts hum with unease. As he pulled into his driveway, something caught his eye. Footprints, faint, but visible in the dirt near the front steps. Someone had been here, standing there for a while, but never going inside. Ethan scanned the street, empty. He exhaled slowly, the weight of old instincts settling in. Someone was watching him. The night air felt heavy as Ethan drove down the empty road leading out of town. The headlights of his truck cut through the darkness, revealing cracked pavement and overgrown ditches. The occasional street lamp flickered, casting long shadows that danced along the edges of his vision. The town had grown eerily silent at this hour, the kind of silence that made the hairs on the back of his neck stand up. He had spent the last few hours fixing up the house, clearing out dust and forgotten memories. It was strange being back, stepping into a life he had left behind so many years ago. But Rosewood wasn't the same place he remembered. As he rounded a tight curve near the outskirts, the sudden wail of a siren cut through the night. The sharp burst of red and blue lights reflected off his rearview mirror. Ethan exhaled slowly, his grip tightening on the steering wheel. He pulled onto the shoulder, the gravel crunching beneath his tires, killing the engine. He waited, watching through the mirror as two silhouettes emerged from the squad car behind him. The first figure moved with an air of authority. Broad-shouldered, deliberate, Sheriff Henderson. His uniform was crisp, his belt heavy with the weight of authority. Real or imagined. The man beside him, however, was different, shorter, stockier, moving with restless energy. Deputy Torres. Unlike Henderson's practiced composure, Torres carried himself like someone who enjoyed his job a little too much. Ethan rolled down his window, keeping his hands in plain sight on the wheel. Henderson approached with an easy stride, stopping just short of the driver's side door. "Evening, Cole," he said smoothly, his voice carrying a familiarity that made Ethan uneasy. "Didn't expect to see you back in town." Ethan met his gaze, calm and steady, just settling in. Torres leaned against the truck's hood, arms crossed. "Yeah? Well, we got a call about a suspicious vehicle matching your description. Thought we'd check it out." Ethan didn't move. "Suspicious how?" Henderson offered a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "It's probably nothing. Routine stop. But you know how it is. Best to be thorough." Torres pushed himself off the hood, stepping closer. "Mind if we take a look inside the truck?" Ethan didn't flinch. "You got a warrant?" Torres' jaw tightened. "Just a simple request, Cole. If you got nothing to hide, this won't take long." Ethan had seen this game before. The polite request that wasn't really a request. The careful pressure, meant to make someone feel like refusing would only make things worse. He didn't take the bait. "I know the law, deputy. No probable cause. No search." Torres scoffed, then, without warning, shoved Ethan's shoulder hard against the seat. "That's so? Because to me, you look awful tense for someone who's got nothing to hide." Henderson placed a firm hand on Torres' arm, pulling him back just enough to maintain control of the situation. "Easy now," he said, playing the part of the reasonable one. "No need for things to get out of hand." Ethan straightened, keeping his voice level. "I'd appreciate it if we could wrap this up." Henderson exhaled through his nose, then nodded toward Torres. "Let him go." Torres took a step back, but his smirk didn't fade. Henderson adjusted his belt, then leaned in slightly, lowering his voice just enough to make the next words feel personal. "Caution's a good thing, Cole, but see, this town's got its own way of handling things. You'd do well to remember that." Ethan didn't respond. He didn't need to. Henderson studied him for a moment longer, then straightened. "You're free to go." Ethan rolled up his window, started the engine, and pulled away, the squad car lingering in his mirror until it disappeared around the bend. As he neared his street, something in his gut told him the night wasn't over. And he was right. A pair of headlights flickered in the distance, trailing behind him. It wasn't a police car. Morning light crept through the blinds, casting thin slants of gold across the wooden floor. Ethan sat on the edge of his bed, rubbing the back of his neck, the uneasy weight of the previous night still pressing on his chest. Something was off. He pulled on a t-shirt and jeans, grabbed his coffee, and stepped out onto the porch. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth, the remnants of an early morning rain still glistening on the grass. As he sipped from his mug, his eyes drifted toward the edge of the yard. Then he saw it. Faint imprints in the dirt near the back fence. The kind that didn't belong to an animal. Someone had been here. He walked down the steps, following the disturbances in the soil. Whoever it was hadn't entered the house, but they'd lingered, watching. Ethan crouched near the tracks, running a hand over them. The pattern was distinct. Heavy boots. Not sneakers. Someone trained. Someone deliberate. He had spent years tracking footprints overseas. And these weren't casual steps. A slow exhale left his lips. They were testing him. He rose and dusted his hands off against his jeans, his eyes sweeping over the quiet street. The houses looked the same as they always had, but the feeling was different. People were watching, even if they weren't looking directly at him. After finishing his coffee, he locked up and headed into town. The small grocery store on Main Street had been around since he was a kid. Bell over the door, old wooden shelves stacked with canned goods, and a bored teenager behind the register scrolling through his phone. But today, Ethan barely noticed. Because parked across the street, clear as day, was a patrol car. And inside, watching him like they had all the time in the world, sat Henderson and Torres. They weren't even trying to be subtle. Ethan didn't react. He grabbed a few essentials, coffee, bread, some canned beans, then made his way to the counter. As the kid rang him up, Ethan glanced over his shoulder. Torres smirked from the driver's seat. Henderson just gave him a slow, knowing nod. Ethan paid and walked outside, the weight of their stares following him all the way to his truck. He set the bags down in the passenger seat, then leaned on the open door for a moment, locking eyes with them. Neither of the officers moved. Fine, if they wanted to play this game, he'd let them. Instead of driving straight home, he pulled into the small diner a few blocks away, the same place he and Ryan had met the night before. Inside, the air smelled of burnt coffee and fried bacon. Booths lined the walls, most of them occupied by locals. Some were reading newspapers, others quietly eating their breakfast. But a few gave Ethan a sideways glance before returning to their meals. He spotted Ryan sitting in the same booth, flipping through his phone. Across from him was a man Ethan hadn't seen in years, but he recognized him instantly. Tanner Brooks. The reporter had aged, his hair shorter, face leaner, but the sharpness in his eyes hadn't dulled. If anything, it had grown sharper. Ryan looked up first. "You look like hell." Ethan slid into the booth. "Good to see you too." Tanner leaned back, studying him. "Heard you had a run-in last night." Ethan didn't confirm or deny it. "What are you doing in town?" "Same as always. Digging where I shouldn't," Tanner said, sipping his coffee. "And from what I hear, you've found yourself in a hole of your own." Ryan shot him a glance. "Ethan thinks someone was at his house last night." Tanner's face darkened slightly. "That tracks. Henderson doesn't like loose ends. And guys like you, coming back here after all these years? That makes you a loose end." Ethan stirred his coffee but didn't drink it. "I can handle myself." Tanner exhaled through his nose. That's what the others thought too. Ryan's expression tightened. "Ethan, listen. People who've tried pushing back before, they didn't just get harassed. They disappeared." Ethan met his eyes. "Who?" Tanner hesitated, then pulled a small notebook from his pocket, flipping through a few pages before sliding it across the table. Ethan looked down. 4 names. He didn't recognize them, but that didn't mean anything. They all had something in common. Tanner said, they were troublemakers, at least in Henderson's eyes. A schoolteacher who spoke up at a town hall meeting. A mechanic who filed a complaint after Torres broke his wrist during a traffic stop. A kid who tried to report his friend getting beaten up in custody. And a deputy who didn't like what he was seeing. Ryan shifted uncomfortably. Ethan flipped the notebook shut. "You have proof?" Tanner exhaled. "Not enough." Ethan slid the notebook back. "Then I guess we'll have to find some." Ryan let out a slow breath. "This isn't the military, Ethan. You can't just." "Yeah," Ethan cut in. "I know." A shadow passed over them. Torres. He stood by the booth, one hand resting on his belt, the other drumming idly against the table's edge. "Morning, gentlemen." Tanner leaned back, unimpressed. "Deputy." Torres smirked. "You having a nice meal?" Ryan stiffened but didn't say anything. Ethan just met his gaze. Yeah. Torres tapped the table once. Twice. "You know, Cole, I've been thinking, a guy like you, ex-military, all those skills, it'd be a shame if you got yourself in trouble. This town isn't exactly friendly to outsiders." Ethan didn't blink. "I grew up here." "Yeah, but you left," Torres countered. "And when people leave, they don't always fit in when they come back." Tanner shook his head. "Why don't you just say what you came to say?" "Torres?" Torres chuckled, stepping back. "Just some friendly advice. Sometimes it's better to know your place." His eyes flicked back to Ethan, and for the briefest second, his mask of amusement slipped. "Because if you don't," Torres murmured, voice low enough that only Ethan could hear, "someone else will put you there." Then he was gone. Ethan watched him go, jaw tight. Tanner muttered a curse under his breath. Ryan rubbed a hand down his face. Ethan finished his coffee, set the cup down, and stood. He had things to do. The drive home felt longer than usual, the weight of the conversation hanging over him. When he pulled into his driveway, The tension in his chest hadn't eased. And then he saw it. A folded piece of paper wedged into his front door. He stepped onto the porch, the old wood creaking under his weight. Pulling the note free, he unfolded it. The message was short. You might have been a soldier. But here, we run the game. Ethan closed his eyes briefly, then looked up. A car was parked down the street. Not a cop car. Someone was waiting, watching, and they wanted him to know it. The night was thick with silence, broken only by the distant hum of cicadas and the occasional rustling of leaves in the warm southern breeze. Ethan sat in his truck, parked a block away from the sheriff's station, his eyes fixed on the patrol car in the lot. He had been watching it for nearly an hour. Then, just as he expected, Henderson and Torres walked out. They weren't in uniform, no radio chatter, no reports in hand, just two men slipping into a car under the cover of darkness. Their movements too careful to be routine. Ethan started his engine, letting them take the lead. They drove without urgency, cutting through the back roads of Rosewood, away from the main streets. Ethan followed at a distance, keeping his headlights dimmed. The route they took wasn't one that led to a standard patrol. This was deliberate. Eventually, the car turned onto an abandoned lot near an old warehouse on the outskirts of town. Ethan slowed as he approached, pulling over behind a cluster of trees. The place looked like it hadn't been used in years. Rusted metal doors, shattered windows, and graffiti scrawled across the concrete walls. But there were lights inside, and movement. He watched as Henderson and Torres stepped out, speaking to two other men who had been waiting for them. Money changed hands. One of the men, stocky and wearing a dark jacket, handed Henderson a small duffel bag before disappearing into the shadows. Ethan's gut tightened. This wasn't just corruption. This was organized. He grabbed his phone and dialed a number he hadn't used in years. A gruff voice answered after the first ring. Didn't think I'd hear from you again. Need a favor, Jordan, Ethan said, and I don't have time for questions. Jordan Walker had been a specialist in intelligence and reconnaissance during their time in the service. Since leaving the military, he had built a life for himself in cybersecurity. But old habits died hard. Send me what you've got, Jordan said. Ethan quickly typed out a message, attaching a photo of the warehouse and the license plates he had noted. I need to know what Henderson and Torres are involved in. Jordan let out a low whistle. That bad? Maybe worse, Ethan said. Give me an hour. Ethan hung up and turned his focus back to the warehouse. Henderson and Torres were still inside. He could try to get closer, but without knowing who else might be in there, it was a risk he couldn't take. So he waited. 50 minutes later, his phone vibrated. You're not gonna like this, Jordan said. Tell me anyway. There's a case file on a missing person. Jordan continued. Daniel Harper, arrested 2 years ago for resisting arrest, which, by the way, is a charge they love throwing at people with no real evidence. But here's the problem. There's no record of him being released. No court documents, no transfer, no official statement from the department. Ethan's grip on the phone tightened. What are you saying? Jordan hesitated. I'm saying there's a good chance Daniel Harper never left that station alive. Ethan exhaled through his nose. He had suspected Henderson and Torres were dirty. But this was worse than he thought. That's not all, Jordan added. I cross-referenced Henderson's bank activity. Let's just say there's a lot of cash moving through his accounts. And none of it's from his paycheck. Ethan clenched his jaw. I need to find someone who knew Harper. Good luck with that, Jordan said. Most people don't last long when they talk about things they're not supposed to. Ethan ended the call and drove back into town, a plan forming in his head. He parked outside a small house on the east side of town, knocking twice on the weathered door. The man who answered was older, his face lined with deep worry. Marcus Reynolds? Ethan asked. The man hesitated before nodding. You knew Daniel Harper, Ethan stated. It wasn't a question. Marcus tensed. I don't know anything about that. Ethan lowered his voice. I'm not here to cause trouble. I just need to know what happened to him. Marcus glanced around the street, as if expecting someone to be watching. Then, he stepped out onto the porch, keeping his voice low. I saw them take him, Marcus admitted. That night, 2 years ago, he was handcuffed, barely standing. They put him in the back of a squad car, Henderson was driving. Torres was in the passenger seat. And then? Marcus swallowed hard. I never saw him again. Ethan's stomach turned. Did you tell anyone? Marcus gave a bitter laugh. Who the hell was I gonna tell? The same cops that made him disappear? Before Ethan could respond, the sharp crack of gunfire split the air. A bullet slammed into the wood near Marcus's head. Ethan moved fast, grabbing the older man and pulling him down behind the railing. He scanned the street, catching the faint glint of a rifle scope from a building across the way. Another shot rang out, this one hitting Ethan's truck. Inside, Ethan ordered. Marcus didn't argue. Ethan pulled his own pistol from his waistband, eyes scanning the darkness, but whoever was out there was already gone. The message was clear. They were watching, and they wanted him to stop. But Ethan wasn't the type to back down. Later that night, long after Marcus had secured his doors and Ethan had driven home, a knock came at his back door. Ethan tensed. Ryan Mitchell stood there, his face pale under the porch light. He didn't say anything at first, just handed Ethan a folder, thick with documents. Ethan opened it. Bank statements, arrest records, reports of missing persons, and Henderson's name all over them. Ryan swallowed hard. You were right. They've been doing this for years. Ethan flipped to the last page. It was a list of names. Daniel Harper was just one of many. Ethan sat at his kitchen table, the dim glow of the overhead light casting long shadows across the scattered pages in front of him. The file Ryan had handed him the night before was spread open. Its contents a damning indictment of the people running Rosewood. Names, transaction records, missing persons reports. Each piece fit together, painting a picture darker than he had anticipated. Henderson and Torres weren't just dirty cops shaking down locals for bribes. They were part of something much larger. A network that went beyond Rosewood, tied to human trafficking and organized crime. He ran a hand through his hair, exhaling sharply. He had seen this kind of corruption overseas. Government officials turning a blind eye. Law enforcement complicit in crimes they were supposed to prevent. But seeing it here, in his own hometown, made it personal. His phone vibrated. Tanner Brooks. Ethan answered. I've got a lead, Tanner said without preamble. A man named Elijah Moore. Says he survived a beating at the hands of Henderson's guys a few years back. He was too scared to talk then. But now he's willing. Ethan leaned forward. Where is he? He wants to meet in person. Tanner replied. He's paranoid. Doesn't trust phone calls. Can't say I blame him. Set it up, Ethan said. Tanner hesitated. Ethan, you need to be careful. I've already been warned to back off this story. Some guys showed up outside my place last night. Didn't say anything. Just stood there smoking, making sure I saw them. They're not playing around. Ethan's jaw tightened. Neither are we. After hanging up, he dialed another number. His sister answered on the second ring. Ethan. Sophia, he said, cutting straight to the point. I need your help. Sophia Carter had spent the last decade building a reputation as one of the sharpest attorneys in the state. She knew the law inside and out. But more importantly, she knew how to use it. There was a pause on the line before she spoke again. That sounds serious. It is, he admitted. I've got evidence tying Henderson and Torres to something big. Not just abuse of power, trafficking, money laundering, maybe worse. Another pause. Longer this time. Then. Send me what you have. I'll take a look. Ethan hesitated. This could get dangerous. Sophia scoffed. You think I don't know that? He should have known better than to warn her off. She had always been the stubborn one in the family. I'll start drafting a complaint to the Justice Department. She continued. But if we're going up against people this connected, we need undeniable proof. I'm working on it, Ethan said. I hope so, she replied. Because if we don't do this right, we're just putting a target on our backs. Later that afternoon, Ethan met Tanner at a rundown motel on the outskirts of town. The parking lot was mostly empty, save for an old sedan parked near the entrance. Inside, sitting on the edge of the bed, was a man who looked like he had seen better days. Elijah Moore was in his late 40s, his face lined with old bruises that had never quite faded. His hands trembled slightly as he reached for a cigarette. I told myself I'd never talk about this, Moore muttered, lighting up, but I can't keep living like this, looking over my shoulder every damn day. Tanner pulled out his recorder. Tell us what happened. Moore exhaled smoke, his eyes distant. 2 years ago, I got picked up for a DUI. Nothing major. Just one too many beers at the bar. Henderson and Torres took me in. But instead of booking me, they drove me out to some field outside town. Ethan's stomach churned. And then? They beat the hell out of me. Moore said flatly. Said I needed to learn my place. But that wasn't the worst part. There was someone else in the back of their car that night. A kid, maybe 18, 19. He was scared out of his mind. Ethan stiffened. Daniel Harper. Moore nodded. I heard him begging, saying he didn't do anything wrong. Then they dragged him out. I don't know what happened after that. Tanner sat back, expression grim. That's enough to prove a pattern of abuse. But not enough to take them down. Ethan clenched his fists. They needed more. That night, as he drove home, something felt off. A slow-moving sedan trailed him. Its headlights dimmed. He made 3 turns that led nowhere. Just a test to see if they were following him. They were. Before he could react, another car swerved in front of him, forcing him to slam on the brakes. His truck screeched to a halt, barely missing the second vehicle. Before he could reach for his gun, the driver's side door was yanked open. A fist connected with his jaw, the impact sending pain shooting through his skull. Hands grabbed at him, dragging him out of the truck. He fought back, landing a solid punch to one of the men's ribs. But there were too many of them. A baton cracked against the side of his head. His vision blurred. Then darkness. When he came to, he was lying on the ground, his head pounding. His wrists ached. Zip ties bit into his skin. He was in the woods, the ground damp beneath him. Henderson stood over him, arms crossed. You just don't know when to quit, do you? The sheriff mused. Torres crouched next to him, holding a pistol. You're making this real complicated, Cole. Ethan's breathing was slow, steady. He forced his muscles to relax, conserving what little energy he had. Henderson knelt down, voice low. See, we could have worked this out. You could have minded your business, gone on with your life. But you had to start digging. Torres smirked. Now, we've got a problem. Ethan's gaze flicked to the gun in Torres' hand. It wasn't his usual sidearm. This one had a scratched-off serial number. A throwaway gun. They were setting him up. Torres pressed the pistol into Ethan's hand, wrapping his fingers around the grip. Then he shoved it into his waistband like it had been there all along. Drunk veteran found in the woods. Unregistered firearm on him. Henderson murmured. Seems about right. Torres grinned. Sad story. Came back from war. Couldn't adjust. Got in trouble with the law. Took a bad fall. That's what people will say. Ethan forced himself to stay still, his mind racing. They thought they had won. They were wrong. Ethan's head throbbed as he slowly came to. The sterile scent of disinfectant and old coffee filled his nostrils. His wrists ached, metal biting into his skin. He blinked against the harsh fluorescent lights, trying to orient himself. A police station. He was cuffed to a steel chair, the cold from the metal seeping through his shirt. The room was small, windowless, with nothing but a table and a single overhead bulb casting sharp shadows on the walls. Footsteps echoed outside, then the door swung open. Henderson stepped in first, adjusting the cuffs of his shirt like he had all the time in the world. Torres followed, leaning against the wall with that same smug expression he always wore when he thought he had the upper hand. Look who's finally awake, Henderson said, his tone almost amused. You gave us quite a bit of trouble last night, Cole. Ethan didn't reply. His mind was already working through the situation, cataloging details, the soreness in his ribs, the dried blood on his temple, signs of a struggle. His truck was gone, likely impounded, and the gun they had forced into his hand. He knew exactly how this was going to play out. Henderson sat down across from him, placing a file on the table. He flipped it open, pulling out a sheet of paper. Charges include resisting arrest, assaulting an officer, and illegal possession of a firearm. He listed off, barely containing his grin. That's a serious combination. You're looking at some real time, Cole. Ethan remained silent, his jaw tight. Torres chuckled. Come on, nothing to say? That's a first. Henderson slid a tablet across the table, tapping the screen. A grainy video played. It showed Ethan staggering in the woods, the gun in his hand. Torres was in the frame, backing away with his hands raised as if Ethan had attacked him. The footage cut out before anything else could be seen. "You see," Henderson said, feigning sympathy, "we're not unreasonable men. We understand people make mistakes. Veterans like you? Sometimes the war doesn't leave you. Does it?" Ethan clenched his fists. He knew this tactic. Make him look unstable. Paint him as the aggressor. Henderson leaned in slightly. "So here's how this goes. You sign a statement admitting you resisted arrest. You say the gun was yours. In return, we make sure you get a reduced sentence. Maybe even a quiet release if you keep your mouth shut." Ethan met his gaze, unflinching. "And if I don't?" Henderson smirked. "Then this is just the beginning." Torres stepped forward, crossing his arms. "You'll rot in a cell. Cole. And no one will give a damn." The door opened again, breaking the tension. Sophia Carter walked in, heels clicking sharply against the floor. She was dressed in a dark suit, her expression cold and unreadable. The second she saw Ethan, her jaw tightened, but she didn't let any emotion slip through. She turned to Henderson. "My client is done talking." Henderson sat back, folding his hands over his stomach. "He hasn't said anything yet." "Then I guess that makes your little interrogation here a waste of time." She shot back. She dropped a stack of papers onto the table. "I want my client released immediately. And I want a full review of this so-called evidence." Torres scoffed. "You don't call the shots here, sweetheart." Sophia's gaze flicked to him, her voice like steel. "Call me that again, and I will personally see to it that you spend the next 5 years battling civil suits. Maybe longer." Torres' smirk faltered, but Henderson remained calm. He glanced at the papers, flipping through them casually. Sophia turned to Ethan. "We're filing a motion to dismiss. But I need more leverage. We need an outside witness." Ethan exhaled. "We had one. Elijah Moore." Sophia's brow furrowed. "Had? He's missing," Ethan said. Her fingers tightened around the edge of her file. She turned back to Henderson. "If you think you can keep someone locked up on fabricated charges, you're mistaken." Henderson simply smiled. "Let's see what the judge says about that." Sophia's jaw clenched, but she knew this fight wouldn't be won in the room. She turned to Ethan. "I'm getting you out." As she left, Torres gave Ethan one last grin. "Enjoy your stay." Hours passed. Ethan sat in the cell, his mind racing through every possible move he could make. The door finally buzzed open, and Ryan Mitchell stepped in. Ryan looked uneasy, shifting from foot to foot. "You don't belong here." Ethan's voice was quiet but firm. "Then help me get out." Ryan hesitated. "If I do this, I lose everything." Ethan studied his friend. "And if you don't, you lose who you are." Ryan didn't reply. He just turned and walked out. By the time night fell, there was still no sign of Tanner Brooks. Then Sophia called. Her voice was low, urgent. "I just got something. A video. Unedited." Ethan straightened. "From who?" "I don't know. It was anonymous. But it shows everything. Henderson and Torres attacking you first. The whole setup." Ethan gripped the phone. "Then release it." She hesitated. "If I do, the source is compromised. Whoever sent this is still in danger." Ethan exhaled, his mind racing. They finally had the truth. But truth, in the wrong hands, could still get people killed. Ethan stepped out of the police station into the crisp night air, rubbing his sore wrists where the cuffs had dug into his skin. The distant hum of passing cars and the faint scent of rain in the wind told him a storm was rolling in. He welcomed it. Sophia stood beside him, arms crossed, her sharp eyes scanning the empty street. "You're out," she said, keeping her voice low. For now, Ethan didn't ask how she pulled it off. He knew his sister well enough to assume it involved a mix of legal pressure and sheer intimidation. But Henderson wouldn't let this go. He had lost the first round, and men like him didn't handle losses well. They got into her car, driving away in silence. When they were far enough from the station, she finally spoke again. "You need to be careful. They're watching you." Ethan stared out the window. "They've been watching me since the day I got back." Sophia sighed. "I don't just mean Henderson and Torres. Whatever this is, it's bigger than them. People are getting killed over this. Tanner is missing, and I guarantee that's not a coincidence." Ethan's jaw tightened. He had known Tanner for years. The guy was persistent, but he wasn't reckless. If he had vanished, it wasn't because he wanted to. We'll find him, Ethan said. Sophia shook her head. You don't even know where to start. Ethan pulled out his phone and made a call. It rang twice before a familiar voice answered. This better be good, Jordan Walker said. Ethan didn't waste time. I need you to track a missing person. Jordan let out a low chuckle. You're really pulling me into this mess. Huh? You owe me, Ethan reminded him. There was a pause. Then Jordan exhaled. Fine. Give me a name. Tanner Brooks. The line went quiet for a moment. The reporter? Ethan nodded, though Jordan couldn't see him. Yeah, he was working on something big. Then he disappeared. Jordan sighed. Send me whatever details you have. Last known location, phone number, anything. Ethan hung up and did exactly that. If anyone could track Tanner down, it was Jordan. As they reached Ethan's house, Sophia turned to him. Don't do anything stupid. Ethan gave a half smirk. Can't make any promises. Sophia shook her head and drove off. Inside, he locked the door behind him and sat at the kitchen table, staring at the files Sophia had given him earlier. The list of missing names was growing, and the deeper he dug, the uglier it got. A message popped up on his phone. It was from Jordan. Got something. Last signal from Brooks's phone was near an abandoned warehouse outside town. Sending coordinates. Ethan grabbed his keys and headed out. Jordan was already waiting when he got there, leaning against his car with a laptop balanced on the hood. You drive too slow, he muttered. Ethan ignored him. What do you have? Jordan turned the screen toward him. Searched through some police archives. Found a few deleted reports. They all have the same pattern. People arrested by Henderson. But no official release records. No trials. No paperwork. Ethan clenched his jaw. They just disappeared. Jordan nodded. Whatever they're doing, they're covering it up well. Ethan straightened. Let's check out that warehouse. Jordan looked at him like he had lost his mind. You mean right now? You got plans? Jordan sighed, closing his laptop. Fine, but if I get shot, I'm haunting you. They drove in silence, the warehouse coming into view in the distance. The place was old, rusted metal siding barely holding together. The only sign of activity was a single dim light flickering above a side door. Ethan cut the engine. Stay behind me. Jordan scoffed. Like hell I will. They moved toward the entrance cautiously. Ethan tried the door. It was unlocked. That was never a good sign. The interior was dark, the air thick with dust. Old machinery sat abandoned in the corners, long forgotten. Then they heard it, a muffled groan. Jordan tensed. That sounded human. Ethan followed the noise, leading them deeper into the warehouse. Then he saw him. Tanner. He was tied to a chair. His face bruised, his breathing ragged, his shirt was torn, dried blood staining the fabric. Ethan moved fast, untying the ropes. Tanner, can you hear me? Tanner's eyes fluttered open. You took your damn time. Jordan let out a breath of relief. He's alive. Then, from the shadows, a voice. Yeah, but you won't be. Ethan spun just as gunfire erupted. Jordan dove for cover as bullets shattered the crates around them. Shadows moved in the darkness. Men. Armed and waiting. This wasn't just Henderson and Torres. This was something bigger. Ethan grabbed Tanner, dragging him behind a stack of metal barrels. Jordan pulled his gun, cursing under his breath. This is why I don't hang out with you. Ethan ignored him, peeking over the barrels. The gunmen were closing in. They needed to get out. Fast. The engine roared as Ethan slammed the gas pedal, kicking up dust and gravel as he sped down the dark backroads outside Rosewood. The adrenaline was still coursing through his veins, his pulse hammering against his skull. Jordan sat in the passenger seat, panting, gripping his laptop like it was the only thing keeping him grounded. Behind them, the warehouse loomed in the rearview mirror, its broken windows reflecting the dim glow of distant headlights. Tanner's gone, Jordan muttered, running a shaking hand through his hair. They took him. Ethan's grip tightened on the wheel. He had known it the second he realized Tanner wasn't with them. In the chaos of the gunfire, the shadows shifting between crates, he had lost sight of him. And now, Henderson and his people had him. Jordan exhaled sharply. We need to go back. We go back. We're walking into a trap. Ethan said. Jordan slammed his fist on the dashboard. Then what the hell do we do? Ethan didn't answer. Not yet. 10 minutes later, they pulled into an abandoned gas station off the highway. The place had been shut down for years, but it was out of sight and far enough from town that they could regroup. Jordan climbed out first, pacing near the rusted gas pumps. Damn it, Tanner. Why did he go after this alone? Ethan reached into his pocket, pulling out something he had grabbed in the last moments before they fled the warehouse. A phone. Tanner's phone. The screen was cracked, one corner completely shattered, but it wasn't beyond saving. Jordan's eyes locked onto it. That's his? Ethan nodded. Found it near where they grabbed him. Jordan didn't waste a second. He popped open his laptop, connecting the device with a cable, fingers moving swiftly over the keyboard. Come on, he muttered. A few moments passed before he let out a relieved breath. All right, we're in. Most of the data's corrupted. But there's one thing. Ethan leaned over. On the screen was an unsent text message, typed out but never delivered. It was addressed to him. If anything happens to me, look into the name R. Calloway. Henderson and Torres aren't the ones in charge. They answered to someone bigger. Ethan stared at the name, his stomach twisting. Calloway? Jordan frowned. That name mean anything to you? Ethan shook his head. No, but we're about to find out. The next morning, Ethan and Sophia stood outside Rosewood's town hall. The building, a relic from another era, had seen better days. The white paint had chipped away in places, and the front steps creaked underfoot. Mayor Franklin Harlan sat behind his oversized mahogany desk, his expression carefully neutral. A man who had spent years in politics knew how to keep his face unreadable. But Ethan could see the tension in his jaw. Sophia placed a folder in front of him. We need to talk about Henderson. The mayor sighed, leaning back in his chair. Miss Carter, I understand your concerns, but I'm afraid you're mistaken. Sheriff Henderson has served this town for years. Sophia cut him off. Served it, or controlled it? Harlan hesitated. Ethan leaned forward, his voice low and steady. We know about the missing people, the payoffs, and we know Henderson and Torres aren't working alone. Harlan's fingers drummed against the desk. You don't have proof. Sophia flipped open the folder, revealing copies of bank records, reports of missing persons, and the name that mattered most. Calloway. Harlan's face twitched. It was brief, but Ethan caught it. Sophia folded her arms. That name means something to you. The mayor was quiet for a long moment. Then he exhaled slowly. You don't understand how deep this goes, he murmured. Ethan clenched his fists. Then explain it to me. Harlan rubbed his temples. You think Henderson is the problem? He's just a piece of it. A tool. You cut him down, and another will take his place. Sophia pressed on. Then who's really in charge? Harlan hesitated again, then shook his head. Walk away from this, both of you, before it's too late. Ryan Mitchell sat in his patrol car, staring at his laptop screen. He had spent the past 2 hours combing through arrest records, looking for anything that didn't add up. And there it was. A pattern. Names of people who had been taken in on minor charges, loitering, traffic violations, public disturbances, names that never showed up in the system again. Deleted reports, purged files. Henderson had someone covering for him. Ryan leaned back, running a hand down his face. He had known things were bad. But this was something else. A message popped up on his screen. Incoming transfer. Then, an audio file. Frowning, he clicked it. Tanner's voice crackled through the speakers. They keep a list. A goddamn list of people they've gotten rid of. Henderson, Torres. They take the orders. But someone else is pulling the strings. And I found the name. The recording cut off abruptly. Ryan's heart pounded. He had to get this to Ethan. Jordan stared at the decrypted message on his laptop, the weight of it pressing down on him like a vice. The list Tanner had mentioned? He had found it. Names. Dozens of them. People who had disappeared. Some of them Ethan had already uncovered. But others, they had never even made the news. Then, at the very bottom of the list, a new entry. Sophia Carter. Jordan swallowed hard. The same second he saw it, his phone buzzed. A message from Sophia. Meet me at my office. Urgent. He grabbed his keys and ran. Sophia sat in her office, flipping through a stack of legal briefs when she heard the mail slot creak. A single envelope slid through, landing on her desk. No return address. Frowning, she picked it up and opened it. Inside was a single sheet of paper. One sentence. If you keep going, your family will be next. Sophia's blood ran cold. Sophia sat at her desk, staring at the note in her hands. The words were simple, but the weight behind them was suffocating. If you keep going, your family will be next. The message wasn't a threat. It was a promise. Her fingers tightened around the paper before she tossed it into the drawer. Locking it, she had been in courtrooms long enough to recognize fear tactics. And this wasn't going to work on her. If anything, it only confirmed that they were getting too close to the truth. She reached for her phone and dialed Ethan. He answered on the first ring. I got a warning, she said, a direct one. His voice was steady. You okay? I'm fine, she replied, but we don't have much time. I've been tracing the financial transactions you sent me. Henderson and Torres aren't just pocketing bribes. There's a network of shell companies funneling money to them. And it's not coming from just one source. Ethan listened, his mind already piecing things together. So who's pulling the strings? Sophia exhaled. I don't know yet, but I have a lead. A businessman in town. Raymond Holt. He's connected to a few of these companies. And he's got ties to government contracts. If anyone knows how this money is moving, it's him. I'll handle it, Ethan said. She hesitated. Be careful. Ethan didn't answer. He ended the call and grabbed his keys. Ryan Mitchell had spent the past hour in his patrol car, parked outside the Rosewood Sheriff's office, staring at the building like it might collapse under the weight of its own corruption. Inside, he could feel the shift. The way conversations stopped when he entered a room. The looks he was starting to get from some of the other deputies. Someone had figured out that he was working against them, and it was only a matter of time before they acted on it. His phone buzzed. Ethan. Ryan answered. Tell me you have something. Not yet, Ethan replied, but I'm about to. Ryan rubbed his temple. This is getting worse. Henderson is spreading rumors that you're unstable, that you've got PTSD and you're paranoid. People are starting to believe it. Ethan let out a short laugh. Humorless. They're setting the stage. If they take me out, no one will ask questions. Ryan swallowed hard. We need to get ahead of this. Fast. Then meet me in an hour. Ethan said, I have someone we need to talk to. Raymond Holt's office sat in the nicer part of town, inside a brick building with polished glass doors. From the outside, it looked like any other legitimate business. But Ethan knew better. He stepped inside, walking past the receptionist without a glance, straight toward Holt's door. He knocked once. Come in, a voice called. Ethan entered. Holt was a man in his 50s, dressed in a tailored suit, silver hair combed back. He didn't look surprised to see Ethan. I was wondering when you'd show up, Holt said, leaning back in his chair. Ethan sat across from him. Then you know why I'm here. Holt chuckled. I have an idea. Ethan didn't bother with pleasantries. Tell me about the money. Holt sighed, as if this conversation was an inconvenience rather than a threat. You're asking the wrong person. Cole, I'm just a businessman. I move numbers around. I don't ask where they come from. Ethan leaned forward, lowering his voice. Henderson and Torres work for someone. Who? Holt studied him, tapping his fingers against the desk. Then he let out a slow breath. The mayor, he said. Ethan's eyes narrowed. Holt continued. Mayor Harland isn't the mastermind. But he's not clean, either. He's been pressured into keeping quiet about what's happening in this town. The money moves through city contracts, through deals that don't look suspicious on paper. Henderson is the one handling things on the ground. But the real players are above him. Ethan processed this. If Harland was compromised, it meant any official attempt to take Henderson down would hit a wall. Holt's gaze darkened. I'll give you one more name. State Trooper Charles Warren. He's high up, knows things. But if you go after him, you better be sure. Ethan nodded, then stood. You should leave town, he said. Holt smirked. And miss all the fun? Ethan didn't reply. He walked out, pulling out his phone as he did. Sophia's office was quiet, but her mind was racing. She had just received a message from an unknown number. The text was simple. Tomorrow, midnight, the old freight yard. Bring no one. And attached to it, a document. She clicked on it, and her breath caught. It was an internal memo. Marked confidential. It outlined a scheduled meeting between state officials and a group that had been flagged in multiple criminal investigations. Henderson wasn't just working with criminals. He was working with people in power. She immediately called Ethan. "I got something," she said. "Me too," he replied. She took a deep breath. "I think we just found our way in." The road leading to the estate was lined with towering oaks, their twisted branches casting eerie shadows under the moonlight. The house itself sat at the top of a hill, a sprawling mansion with stone columns and massive glass windows that reflected the dark sky. The kind of place where power met in secret, far from the eyes of the public. Ethan parked a quarter-mile away, cutting the engine. Jordan and Ryan sat beside him, both tense, going over the plan one last time. "We go in, get the recordings, and get out," Ethan said. "No unnecessary risks." Jordan exhaled sharply. "Right, because sneaking into a house full of corrupt politicians and criminals is completely risk-free." Ryan shot him a look. "You can stay in the car if you want." Jordan scoffed. "Like hell I will." Ethan adjusted the small camera attached to his shirt. "Ryan, you stay on comms. Keep an eye on security and give us a heads up if anything changes." Ryan nodded. "I tapped into the estate's security feed. I'll guide you through." Ethan and Jordan slipped out of the car, moving through the tall grass toward the rear of the property. The air was thick with humidity, the scent of damp earth clinging to their clothes. Ryan's voice crackled in their earpieces. "You've got 2 guards at the back entrance, both armed. You'll need to find another way in." Ethan scanned the perimeter, eyes landing on a second-story balcony. A gutter pipe ran along the side of the house, leading straight up. He nudged Jordan. "Think you can climb?" Jordan sighed. "I hate you." They moved quickly, scaling the side of the house with careful precision. The metal was slick from condensation, but they reached the balcony without incident. Ethan eased the door open, slipping inside. The interior was even more extravagant than expected. Crystal chandeliers, marble floors, gold accents on the furniture. But beneath the luxury, there was an unsettling coldness. This wasn't just a home. It was a fortress. Ryan's voice came through. "Meetings in the main study. First floor, west wing." Ethan and Jordan moved silently, sticking to the shadows. They passed empty hallways, their footsteps muffled by thick carpets. From below, the murmur of voices carried through the halls. As they reached the study door, Ethan pulled out a small recording device and attached it under the table. Jordan positioned a second device behind a painting on the wall. Then they waited. The door opened, and a group of men walked in. Henderson and Torres were among them. But they weren't alone. A new voice spoke, smooth and authoritative. "Gentlemen, we have a problem." Ethan didn't recognize the voice, but the weight it carried was undeniable. Whoever this was, he wasn't just another corrupt official. He was the one pulling the strings. The man continued. "The heat is rising. We need to accelerate the timeline. Henderson, your job is to keep the locals in check. Torres, I expect results. The shipments can't be delayed." Ethan's stomach twisted. Shipments. This wasn't just about corruption. It was trafficking. Jordan's hands clenched into fists. He had spent years in cybersecurity, exposing financial fraud. But this was something else entirely. This was human lives being bought and sold. Torres spoke up. "There's another problem. Coal." Ethan stilled. "He's been digging too deep." Torres continued. "And now his sister is involved." The unknown man sighed. "Then make sure he's not a problem anymore." Ethan exchanged a glance with Jordan. They had heard enough. Ryan's voice suddenly cut through. "Get out, now." Ethan didn't hesitate. They turned back the way they came. But as they reached the hallway, a shadow stepped in front of them. A man dressed in black, his expression cold and emotionless. He wasn't just another bodyguard. He was something else. Ryan's voice was sharp. "That's not one of theirs. He's a cleaner." Ethan knew what that meant. The man lunged. Ethan ducked just as a blade slashed through the air where his throat had been. Jordan stumbled back as Ethan countered with a sharp jab to the ribs. The man barely flinched. He was fast, too fast. Ethan blocked another strike, twisting the man's wrist. But before he could disarm him, a knee slammed into his stomach. Jordan pulled his gun. "Ethan, Move. Ethan dodged just as Jordan fired. The bullet clipped the man's shoulder. But he didn't go down. Instead, he smiled. Then he pulled his own gun. Jordan fired again, but the man was already moving. The shot missed, shattering a nearby vase. Alarms blared. Ryan's voice was urgent. You've got company. Every guard in that house is coming your way. Ethan grabbed Jordan and ran. They made it back to the balcony. But as they climbed down, gunfire erupted from below. Jordan let out a sharp cry. Ethan caught him before he fell, lowering him to the ground. Blood soaked through his shirt. Ryan's voice came through. They're surrounding the estate. You need to move now. Ethan gritted his teeth. He could hear tires screeching in the distance. Then, headlights flooded the yard. Henderson and Torres. And they weren't alone. A dozen armed men stepped out, weapons drawn. Torres grinned. Going somewhere, Cole? Ethan's hands curled into fists. They were trapped. Ethan's breath was steady, but his mind raced. The odds were against them. Henderson, Torres, and a dozen armed men stood between him and any chance of escape. Jordan was bleeding out beside him, barely conscious, and Ryan had just made the choice that would put a permanent target on his back. Torres smirked, his gun raised. You should have stayed gone, Cole. Ethan ignored him, glancing at Ryan. Can you still shoot? Ryan nodded once, shifting his stance. Ethan gave a barely perceptible signal. Then he moved. A single heartbeat later, Ryan fired. The shot was clean, precise. One of Henderson's men crumpled to the ground, his rifle clattering against the dirt. The momentary shock gave Ethan the opening he needed. He grabbed Jordan by the collar, hauling him toward the nearest cover, a stack of crates near the edge of the property. Bullets ripped through the night, splintering wood and kicking up dirt as they dove behind them. Stay awake, Ethan ordered Jordan, pressing a hand against the wound on his side. The bleeding wasn't slowing. Jordan coughed, his voice weak. I hate this plan. Ryan fired again, forcing Torres and his men to scatter. I didn't know we had a plan. Ethan checked his surroundings. He needed something. Anything. To tip the balance. Then he saw it. A truck, parked near the main house. A cargo truck, its doors slightly ajar, and inside, a figure slumped over, barely moving. Tanner. Ethan cursed under his breath. Ryan, cover me. Ryan didn't hesitate. As Ethan darted toward the truck, Ryan provided suppression fire, forcing Henderson's men to stay low. Ethan reached the vehicle, yanking the door open. Tanner's wrists were zip-tied, his face bruised and swollen. He blinked at Ethan, dazed. They wanted me to talk, Tanner muttered, his voice hoarse. You still in one piece? Ethan asked, cutting the restraints. Tanner gave a weak chuckle. Define one piece. Ethan helped him down just as another shot rang out. Barely missing his head, he turned to see Henderson, bleeding from a shoulder wound, staggering toward a waiting car. We can't let him leave. Ethan growled. Torres and Victor Sloan weren't far behind, advancing with cold precision. You get Tanner out of here, Ryan said, reloading his gun. Ethan looked at him. Not happening. Ryan smirked. Wasn't a request. Before Ethan could argue, a new sound filled the air. Siren wails. But instead of relief, his stomach dropped. The reinforcements weren't allies. As squad cars pulled up, uniformed officers stepped out, weapons drawn. But their eyes weren't on Henderson or Torres. They were looking straight at Ethan. Torres grinned. Looks like your luck just ran out. Ethan clenched his jaw. This wasn't over. Ethan's wrists burned from the rough rope digging into his skin. His breathing was steady, controlled, but his mind raced. They had been caught, again. But this time, Henderson wasn't playing games. The warehouse smelled of oil and damp concrete. Dim overhead bulbs cast weak light over the rusted steel beams, flickering every few seconds. The place was old, abandoned, perfect for making people disappear. Ryan sat a few feet away, his face tense, eyes darting around for exits. Jordan was slumped against a crate, his breathing shallow from blood loss. Tanner, his face bruised and swollen, glared at Torres, who stood a few feet away with a pistol in hand. Henderson adjusted his tie, watching them like a man with all the time in the world. I have to say, Cole, you've been a real pain in my ass. But this This is where it ends. Ethan stayed silent, studying the men in the room. There were 6 of them, all armed. Henderson and Torres stood near the entrance, their guns casual but ready. Victor Sloan, the assassin, leaned against a crate, watching everything with cold detachment. The other 3 men were lower-ranking officers, the kind Henderson used to do his dirty work. One of them, though, didn't quite fit. A younger officer, maybe mid-30s, stood slightly apart from the others. He kept shifting his weight, fingers twitching near his holster. There was tension in his jaw, uncertainty. Ethan focused on that. Henderson gestured to the far end of the warehouse, where barrels of gasoline were stacked haphazardly. You know, accidents happen all the time in places like this. Faulty wiring, a spark, and boom, whole building goes up in flames. Real tragedy. Torres chuckled, nudging Tanner with his boot. You're gonna be a hell of a headline. Brooks, local reporter perishes in warehouse fire. Bet they'll even name an award after you. Tanner spat blood onto the floor. Go to hell. Torres' smirk faded. He grabbed Tanner by the collar and drove a fist into his ribs. Tanner gasped, his body jerking against the restraints. Ryan tensed. Enough. Torres turned to him, amused. Or what? Ethan clenched his fists. He needed a way out. But he also needed to time this perfectly. Henderson sighed. We're wasting time. Torres, take care of the cop first. Torres grinned, raising his pistol at Ryan. And that's when Ethan saw it. The young officer, Daniel Reeves, his hand twitched near his belt. His jaw tightened. Doubt. Ethan locked eyes with him and made his move. With a sharp jerk, he twisted his wrists, the rope scraping against raw skin. The chair wobbled beneath him as he shifted his weight. Torres was distracted by his own arrogance, not even looking when Ethan kicked his legs forward, knocking over the chair and slamming his body into Torres' knees. The shot went wide, shattering a nearby barrel instead of Ryan's skull. The warehouse erupted into chaos. Ryan lunged, slamming his shoulder into one of the other officers. Tanner rolled onto his side, twisting against his restraints. Jordan, barely conscious, groaned in pain but didn't move. And then, Daniel Reeves made his decision. The young officer drew his weapon and turned it on Henderson's men. The first shot took one of them in the chest. The second dropped another before he even had time to react. Torres spun in shock. What the? Daniel Reeves shot him in the leg. Ethan didn't hesitate. In the moment of distraction, he felt something small and sharp press against his palm. A blade slipped into his grasp by Daniel Reeves. A single glance, a silent understanding. Then Ethan went to work. He cut through the ropes in 2 swift motions, yanking free just as Henderson dove for cover. Ethan lunged, grabbing Torres' wrist before he could lift his gun again. A struggle, a wild swing. Then Ethan drove the knife into Torres' shoulder. The man screamed, stumbling back. Ryan had taken control of the second gun, now covering the remaining men. Nobody move. Henderson's eyes darted around, calculating. His hand edged toward his waistband. Don't, Ethan warned. Henderson froze, teeth clenched. You don't get it, do you? Even if you walk out of here, you've already lost. Ethan wiped blood off his knuckles. We'll see about that. Victor Sloan, the assassin, had stayed back, watching with eerie calm. He wasn't rattled. If anything, he looked amused. He stepped forward. Interesting, he murmured. I underestimated you. Ethan's muscles coiled, ready for another fight. But then, sirens. Loud, close. Victor Sloan tilted his head, as if listening to a distant sound. Then he stepped back, fading into the shadows. Gone. Ethan exhaled. He turned to Daniel Reeves. Who are you? The young officer holstered his gun. FBI. I've been undercover for months. Henderson and his people have no idea how high this goes. Ryan let out a slow breath. And now? Daniel Reeves looked around. Now, we end this. Outside, the sirens wailed louder. This fight wasn't over. Not yet. Ethan's hands moved fast, the blade slicing clean through the ropes that bound his wrists. He kept his breathing steady, ignoring the sharp sting where the restraints had already rubbed his skin raw. This was the moment. The warehouse was buzzing with movement. Henderson's men were securing the last of the explosives. stacking barrels of fuel near the far wall. A countdown had begun, both literal and figurative. If they didn't make their move now, they'd never get another chance. Across the room, Torres paced impatiently, gripping his pistol, his trigger finger twitching. He wasn't interested in waiting for the explosion. He wanted Ethan dead now. This is taking too damn long. Torres growled. Just put a bullet in his head and let's be done with it. Henderson, standing near the exit, barely glanced up. Patience. We do this right. There's no loose ends, no bodies to explain, just a fire. That's the difference between professionals and amateurs. Torres sneered. Yeah? Well, I'm done waiting. He stepped closer, raising his gun toward Ethan. And that was the opening Ethan needed. He jerked forward, knocking over a metal crate with his foot. The loud crash startled the men closest to him. In that split second, Daniel Reeves acted. The undercover agent spun on his fellow officers, drawing his gun and firing point blank into the chest of the man standing beside him. The gunshot echoed through the warehouse like a thunderclap. Torres spun in shock. What the? Ethan lunged, ramming into him before he could react. The gun went off, the bullet flying harmlessly into the ceiling. The warehouse exploded into chaos. Tanner kicked out, knocking one of the guards off balance. Ryan scrambled for the gun that had fallen from the dead man's grasp. Henderson's men hesitated, confused, unsure of who was betraying who. Ethan didn't give Torres time to recover. He drove his knee into the man's gut, then twisted the gun from his grip. Torres swung wildly, catching Ethan across the jaw. Pain exploded in his skull, but he absorbed it, countering with a brutal elbow to the side of Torres' head. Torres staggered, shaking off the hit. Then he reached for the knife at his belt. Ethan saw it too late. The blade flashed, slicing across his forearm. He hissed but didn't slow down. He twisted, catching Torres' wrist before the knife could strike again. For a moment, it was sheer strength against strength. Then Ethan let go. Just long enough for Torres to overextend, before driving his fist straight into the man's throat. Torres collapsed, gasping for air. Ethan kicked the knife away. Gunfire erupted on the other side of the warehouse. Ryan had managed to get his hands on a weapon and was laying down cover fire for Daniel Reeves, who was moving swiftly between the stacks of crates. Tanner had taken a bad hit. His left arm hung limp, blood soaking through his sleeve, but he was still on his feet, fighting. Then, in the distance, sirens. Henderson's head snapped toward the entrance. No, 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 he muttered under his breath. The sound of engines revving filled the air. Then the doors to the warehouse burst open. Sophia Carter led the charge. FBI agents and state troopers swarmed the warehouse. Weapons drawn, Henderson's men turned, confused, realizing too late that their boss had already slipped out the back. Torres, still gasping on the ground, barely had time to react before two agents pinned him down and cuffed him. Ryan let out a breath, lowering his gun. About damn time. Ethan wiped blood from his mouth, scanning the warehouse. The battle was over, but the war wasn't. Sophia made her way to him, eyes sharp, face unreadable. Henderson's gone. Ethan wasn't surprised. Henderson was a survivor, a snake that had just shed its skin, ready to slither away and find another hole to crawl into. Then one of the agents called out, "Sir, we found something." Ethan and Sophia followed them toward a metal cabinet tucked away near the back of the warehouse. Inside, beneath stacks of cash, was a black ledger. Sophia flipped through it, her eyes widening. "This isn't just a list of payouts," she whispered. "This is everyone. Judges, politicians, state officials, every name that's ever been bought." Ryan peered over her shoulder. "That's enough to bring the whole damn system down." Ethan exhaled. They had what they needed. But Henderson was still out there, and he wasn't the type to let a grudge go. This wasn't over. Not yet. The engine roared as Henderson's black SUV sped down the winding backroads of Rosewood. Dust and gravel kicked up behind his tires, the taillights flashing red like the last embers of a dying fire. But Henderson wasn't finished. Not yet. Ethan gripped the wheel of his truck tighter, the headlights cutting through the darkness as he chased the man who had spent years poisoning this town. The weight of the stolen ledger sat on the passenger seat beside him. Every name, every transaction, Every crime Henderson had tried to bury. FBI vehicles followed close behind, sirens wailing in the night. Sophia's voice crackled through Ethan's radio. He's heading toward the old industrial site. You need to end this before he disappears for good. Working on it, Ethan muttered. Ryan was in the passenger seat, loading his gun. You know he's not going to let them take him alive. Ethan's jaw clenched. Then we make sure he doesn't have a choice. The industrial site had been abandoned for years. A graveyard of rusted machinery and broken concrete. Henderson's SUV screeched to a stop near an old warehouse. He jumped out, his breath ragged, his suit covered in sweat and dust. A man was already waiting for him. Patrick Vaughn. Daniel Price. A former police captain who had vanished from Rosewood years ago, only to reappear when it benefited men like Henderson. You got sloppy, Price said, glancing at the distant headlights closing in. Henderson scowled. Shut up and get me out of here. Price hesitated. There's heat all over this town. Maybe it's time to. Henderson grabbed him by the collar, shoving a gun under his chin. We're not having this conversation. Get me out of here. The moment stretched, heavy with tension. Then the roar of another engine. Ethan's truck skidded to a stop. Ryan jumped out first, gun raised. Drop it, Henderson. The FBI agents fanned out, their weapons trained. Henderson exhaled slowly. Then, in a single motion, he grabbed Price and yanked him close, pressing the barrel of his gun against the man's temple. Back off, Henderson shouted, or he dies. Price's eyes widened in horror. Are you serious? Ethan took a step forward, his hands steady, his gaze locked onto Henderson's. You're out of options. Henderson laughed, but there was a wild edge to it. You don't get it, Cole. You think this ends with me? I'm just the beginning. You can put me in cuffs. But another man will take my place. Another after that. This system? It eats men like you alive. Ethan let the words settle. He had spent his entire life fighting wars, only to come home and find another one waiting. And Henderson wasn't wrong. This wasn't the end of corruption. It wasn't the end of men like him. But it was the end of this man. You talk too much, Ethan said. Then, in a flash, he moved. A single, precise shot rang out. Henderson's knee buckled as Ryan's bullet tore through his leg. He screamed, collapsing onto the pavement. The gun tumbled from his grip. Price stumbled back, panting, his hands raised in surrender. FBI agents swarmed forward, securing the scene, pressing Henderson's face into the dirt as they cuffed him. Ethan stood over him, staring down as the former sheriff groaned in pain. You had your time, Ethan said. It's over. Henderson looked up, a trickle of blood running from the corner of his mouth. And then he smiled. You really think that? He rasped. You think you won? His gaze flicked toward the ledger still sitting in Ethan's truck. You'll burn one man, Henderson murmured, but the fire doesn't stop with me. Ethan felt something cold settle in his chest. The fight was over, but the war had just begun. Ethan stood by the courthouse steps, watching as Henderson was escorted inside. The once untouchable sheriff was in cuffs, his face bruised from the night before. But there was no fear in his eyes, only calculation. The cameras flashed, reporters shouting questions, but Henderson kept his head down. His lawyer walked beside him, murmuring something under his breath. This was just another move in the game for him. Ryan joined Ethan, slipping his hands into his pockets. Feels too easy, doesn't it? Ethan exhaled. Because it is. Behind them, Sophia and Tanner emerged from the building, deep in conversation. Tanner was still bandaged from his injuries, but the fire in his eyes had returned. He had spent the morning finalizing his article, and the impact was already rippling across the country. FBI just confirmed Torres is talking, Sophia said as she approached. He's giving up names. Ryan let out a dry chuckle. So now he grows a conscience. Ethan shook his head. Not conscience. Survival. Torres wasn't stupid. He had seen the writing on the wall. And rather than go down with the ship, he had decided to cut a deal. He had named judges, politicians, business leaders, people who had been funneling money into Henderson's operation for years. But even with the case unraveling, Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that something was missing. They had taken down Henderson. But who was protecting him? Inside the federal building, Victoria Gaines, A middle-aged woman in a gray suit with sharp eyes sat across from Sophia and Ethan. She tapped her pen against a thick file, her expression unreadable. "The evidence is solid," Sophia said. "Torres has confirmed everything. The financial records, the missing persons cases, the payoffs. Henderson wasn't just running a dirty sheriff's department. He was part of something bigger." Victoria Gaines sighed, leaning back. "Bigger is exactly the problem. If we push this too far, we're going to start stepping on the wrong toes." Ethan's hands curled into fists. "So what, we stop?" "That's not what I said," Victoria Gaines replied, leveling a gaze at him. "I said we need to be careful. People in power don't just roll over. They retaliate, and if we go after them, we need to be prepared for what comes next." Sophia didn't blink. "Then we move forward." A muscle in Victoria Gaines's jaw tightened. Then she slid a folder across the table. "This is what we have so far," she said. "More names, more connections. Some of them go straight to DC." Ethan exchanged a look with Sophia. This wasn't over. That night, Tanner's article went live. The headline alone sent shockwaves through the media. Inside the corrupt empire of Sheriff Henderson, and the powerful figures who enabled him. Within hours, major networks picked up the story. Protesters gathered outside the Rosewood courthouse, demanding deeper investigations. A state senator who had once been an ally of Henderson quietly resigned. The walls were closing in. Ryan was at home when his phone buzzed. He picked it up, expecting a message from Sophia or Ethan. Instead, it was a blocked number. The text was short. "You ruined the game. Watch your back." Ryan's pulse spiked. He looked around his apartment, suddenly feeling the weight of unseen eyes. The fight wasn't over. It had only just begun. The sky over Rosewood was painted in soft oranges and purples as the sun dipped below the horizon. The air was cooler now, the oppressive heat of summer giving way to the first hints of fall. On the surface, the town looked the same: quiet streets, mom and pop stores still standing, people going about their business. But something had shifted. Ethan stood on the porch of his childhood home, staring at the place he had once thought he could return to. Now, it felt like a battleground. The scars of the past few weeks lingered in the air, and despite Henderson's arrest, an unease still coiled in his gut. Behind him, the screen door creaked open. "You really leaving?" Jordan stepped out, moving slower than usual. His injuries had healed, but the fight had taken its toll. He looked better, though, stronger. Ethan nodded, figured I'd head west, maybe somewhere quiet this time. Jordan smirked. "You, quiet?" Ethan huffed a small laugh but didn't respond. They stood there for a moment, letting the silence stretch between them. Jordan glanced toward the road. "You did something real here. You know, people actually believe things can change now." Ethan didn't answer. He wanted to believe that. But change was slow, and corruption had deep roots. The sound of a car approaching made them both turn. Sophia pulled up in her sedan, stepping out with a file tucked under her arm. "You should hear this before you go," she said, handing it over. Ethan took the folder and flipped it open. Inside were pages of reports, financial records, and surveillance photos. His stomach twisted as he scanned the names. These weren't just small-town crooks. These were powerful men who made Henderson look like a foot soldier. Sophia's voice was quiet. "This is bigger than Rosewood." Ethan closed the folder. "And they know we're looking." She hesitated before nodding. "I got a warning yesterday. Officially, the case is moving forward. But off the record, I've been told to back off." Ethan set his jaw. He had seen this before. Justice, only when it was convenient. Ryan had been right. It felt too easy. Jordan looked between them. "So, what now?" Ethan exhaled. His truck was packed. His path was clear. He could walk away, let someone else fight the next battle. But deep down, he already knew the answer. A shadow moved at the edge of the street. A black car sat parked just beyond the reach of the streetlights. Engine idling. Someone was watching. When Ethan stepped forward, the car pulled away. No license plate, no hesitation. Just a quiet message: "We're still here." Ethan watched until the taillights disappeared into the night. Then he looked back at Sophia and Jordan, gripping the folder in his hands. No more running. This wasn't the end. This was just the beginning. Justice isn't just about taking down one corrupt man. It's about facing a system built to protect people like him. Ethan thought his fight ended with Henderson. But the truth? It was only the beginning. Because corruption doesn't die, it adapts. So the real question is, how far would you go to uncover the truth? Let us know in the comments. And if you don't want to miss the next story, subscribe to Covert Truths, where the truth is never as simple as it seems.